Welcome to day number 17 of the 30-day AI Automation Pro Challenge. The challenge where you become an AI Automation Pro in only 30 days, even if you started as a complete beginner. The last 3 days, we talked a lot about very important n8n fundamentals when it comes to automated Google search and research. And yesterday, we learned how to scrape a website. And today, I want to take it even further by showing you an even more complex workflow that I built pretty similar for a real client project that I got paid for. First, I want to show you a little presentation, what kind of problem my client had and how I solved it. And then I will show you a copy of that workflow that is almost the same, but a little bit downgraded so that it is easier to explain it within the challenge. As always, everything will be provided in the resources at challenge.germanaicreator.com completely for free. So if you haven't done that yet, just sign up there completely for free. So let's jump to my screen and have a look at the problem that I solved for my client, and then we will have a look at the workflow. All right, so let's have a look at the presentation. First of all, what was the problem? My client owns a platform for office space. So companies can list their office there and then they can rent it out to other people or other companies. And part of the business model is that the companies get directly connected to the office owners without the platform having to do the transaction and the payment. And this is of course great for the office owners and also for the people looking for an office because everything is super fast and direct. So when a deal is made through the platform, the owners of these office spaces, they owe a commission to my client because they made the deal through my client's platform, right? And here comes the problem. Many don't report the deal to the platform owner. And exactly there comes my workflow into play because my workflow finds out who made a deal and my client gets paid. So this is the general problem. And now I show you how I solve that with my workflow. So everything begins that my workflow searches for the company most related to the person who applied for a certain office space at the platform. When a company is identified, my workflow then scrapes the website of that company and looks for an address match. So I provide my workflow all the addresses the person applied for, and I also provides the workflow the addresses that we found on the company website that we scraped. If there is a match, the workflow ends and everything gets reported in a Google Sheet. But if there is no match right away, the workflow tries 9 other variations of the company domain to find even more information and to increase the likelihood that we discover if there is a match. And then in the end, the LLM analyzes the entire content, and if there are matches, they get stored in a Google Sheet. So this is the general process how my workflow approaches the problem. In reality, there were even more problems, but I tried to make it a little bit simpler for the sake of the video series so that you understand what is happening and that it is more generally usable. Because in reality, there were also IDs involved. There were also domains involved that got provided by the clients, but these were fake domains or organizations that do not even exist, and so on and so on. Later in the series, I will also talk about the real workflow so that you learn even more and that you get the full picture how such an automation can look like. As I said, today I will show you a slightly downgraded version so that it is easier for you to understand what is actually happening. But we come to the real deal. I promise you that. All right, and now I want to show you how this workflow looks like. So actually, these are even 2 workflows. So this is the real client workflow that I built and sold to my client. And as I said, it is actually not one workflow. These are 2 workflows that work together. We have the main workflow that does the research, tries to identify a company, and then it looks at the website, and if there's no match, it sends the URL to the sub workflow. And here we try 13 different domain variations to find a working domain, and then we scrape the working domain and try to identify if there is a match or not. So as I said, I will come to that as well later in the series, but today I will demonstrate you a slightly downgraded version, as you will see in a second. But trust me when I say that the workflow that I present you is already 80% the same functionality. It's just less domains that we try, and we don't have a plausibility check involved. So this is a little bit downgraded, but trust me, it is the same principle. So you learn a lot by that workflow. All right, so let's head over to n8n and check out how that works. And I want to begin with the kind of input that I got provided from my client. Also, this is of course an example because I can't show the real client data, also because of data privacy terms and so on. But what you see here is exactly the kind of structure that I got provided. So we have here a contact person. This is basically the person who was looking for office space on my client's platform and applied for certain offices. And then I got provided all the addresses of offices that this person requested. For example, this person is not existing. Thomas Berger was looking for these addresses. As I said, this is just a made up example. And my task then was to find out, okay, is there any person named Thomas Berger living in the city that the person looked for office space, who has a company? And if there is a company, who has a company website, and when we scrape that website, do we find one of these addresses? Okay, because then we know that the client made a deal through the platform. So this is the overall challenge that I had to solve. And as I said, in reality, there were also an ID provided, and also the client mentioned an organization and mentioned a domain and so on. So I kept it a little bit simpler for the sake of the tutorial, but overall, this is the kind of input that I got provided and that I had to work with. And in reality, there were more than 80,000 of these entries. So it was quite a lot, and the workflow had to run for several hours. All right, so this is the input. And now I want to show you the workflows and where we store the results. So in the end, we have another Google Sheet that I set up also for that tutorial. And whenever we find a match, we want to know who was the contact person, which were the requested addresses that the person made at the platform, and which is the address that we found on that person's website or the company related to that person. Okay, so I hope the picture gets assembled now in your head. And in the next step, we look at the workflow, then we will run it, and then I explain to you how the workflow works. And as always, I will provide you all the workflows that you see here in the tutorial series. All right, so this is part one of the workflow. As you see, it is a little bit downgraded, but trust me when I say it is almost the same functionality. The only thing that is missing is that we don't check for other data points that the client provided. We just look if we find a company related to the person. And in workflow number 2, we don't check so many addresses. We check just 9. And in the workflow that I built for my client, we check, I think, 13 or 14. And in the client workflow, I also used a so-called headless browser to check even more complex websites, but more on that later. We go step by step. If we consider that we just started a couple of days ago within that series with very simple workflows, this is already a huge achievement if you understand a workflow like that. All right, and now first I want to give you a quick run what is happening here, then we fire it up, and then I explain to you exactly what is happening at each step of the workflow. So everything begins with a form upload. So here we upload the list that I just showed you with the contact person and the requested addresses. Then we have a big loop here. You see, this is the huge loop. All until here is one loop. Okay, so everything within here gets applied to every person in the sheet that we provide. And then I zoom in a little bit. In the very first step, we use a LLM to look at the requested addresses and to identify the city where the person was looking for office space. Then in this step, you already know how this works. We use a Google search to search the person together with the city, and we try to find in the context that we get back any company related to that person. And if we find a URL, we provide that URL to that HTTP request. We analyze the HTML content of that page, and we check if there are any addresses found that the person requested. And then if there is no match, we call the sub workflow, and then we provide the same company URL to the sub workflow. This element creates 9 different variations of that domain. For example, domain/imprint, domain/contact, domain/privacy, and so on and so on. You will see that later. And then with different HTTP requests, we test in a first step every single domain if we get a 404 response or not. What is that? If you get a response 404, you know that the domain doesn't exist. And then in the next step, we look here with a code element, okay, which of these domains is existing, which is the first one that was not a 404. Then we apply again a HTTP request. We get the HTML content of that domain that worked. We let the LLM analyze it again, and if there is a match, we store it in the Google Sheet. Okay, so this is the overall functionality of that big workflow. And what you see down here are basically exit points of the sub workflow. So here the sub workflow gets started, and whenever something like that gets hit, it ends the sub workflow, it jumps back to the main workflow, and then it closes the loop and it goes to the next one. Now we will fire up the workflow with the example data. And of course, I manipulated the data a little bit. So this down here is completely fake, my name and 2 addresses in Kiel, Germany. And this is also completely made up, Thomas Berger, and random addresses in Stuttgart. This is my good friend Alexander from Munich. And this is actually where his company is located, okay? And when we fire up now the workflow will identify his company, his domain, it will scrape the website, and then of course it will identify the match. So just think of that. If Alex would have applied for an office at exactly that address, we would find that out now with the workflow. And the others are just random examples, so nothing will be found there. All right, let's test it out. We click here to execute workflow. Then we have to upload the table that you just saw. I upload it. We submit it. And now you see that the workflow starts working. And in the first case, it won't find anything, but it jumps to the sub workflow. Then it goes back. And in the second case, it also doesn't find anything on the main page of my good friend Alex, but in the sub workflow, when it is checking other pages of his website, it will probably and hopefully find a match. And then the loop closes again. It takes another round with the third made up example, and then the workflow is done. And when we go now to the sub workflow, we see that there were also 3 executions. Okay, so it was exactly that one, and that one. And if we look here to the last example, we see that the workflow got provided a domain, this one, which is of course complete nonsense because there is no Dominik Felber in Kiel. So it found just any random domain related to Kiel. And then the workflow checked all of these, and as you can see, most of them threw an error, a 404, because they are not existing. But there was one that is actually existing. If we click on that, we see, okay, it provided HTML content, and it was exactly that website, kielinstitut.de/impressum. So we found a working domain. And then this working domain got provided to the workflow. We scraped the website, we compared with the actual addresses, we found no match, and then it exited the workflow. And now we look at the second case, which was my friend's company. And here we already see that a match was discovered. So when we go to the Google Sheet, we see now, okay, perfect, it found the address. And what is pretty cool is that I never mentioned my friend's domain. It was the Google search who found that out. So let's have a look how this actually happened. When we go to the main workflow and we go here to the second iteration of the loop, we see that in the second iteration it was my friend's term where we checked for these addresses. And then when we look at the first LLM element, and also here the second iteration, we see that the LLM discovered that all these requested office spaces were out of Munich. And then in the next step, also in the second iteration, when we go to search terms, we see we searched for Alexander Sekulic and München. So this is already correct. And then in the next step, we used another LLM, also here the second execution. And you see that it found the domain https elitebody.de. So this is exactly my friend's company, and this was just found by using the automated Google search, how you learned it also just a couple of days ago. Then in the next step, we provided that URL to the HTTP request element. And when we go here to the second execution, we see also that provided data. So it is an existing URL, but it is the main domain. So it is not very likely that there is an address. Then we made the LLM look at that content, and as you can see, there was no matching address found. And because there was no match found, the workflow provided the URL to the sub workflow. And within the sub workflow, we are also here in the second iteration, the one that covered my friend's company. When we go here to the webhook, we see that my friend's name got provided, his company URL got provided that the Google search discovered, and also the requested addresses. Okay, then this code element created these variations of his domain. You see https elitebody.de/impressum. And what is the impressum? The impressum is the so-called imprint page. This is something that is mandatory in Germany, in Austria, in Switzerland, and it's pretty practical because on that page you always find the address of business owners. And as you see, I always try to scrape different variations of these impressum pages. And of course, we also scrape the data policy page, the contact page, and the contact.html page in case that this is not existing. So as you see, this was for a German client. Because of that, I used German names here, but you can easily adapt it also to English or US companies by just adjusting that part of the code. All right, and what we see here is that already the very first actually worked. You see, it was success when we tried it with a HTTP request, and exactly that code element down here looks at all the responses, and then it provides the first working URL to the HTTP request that we see here. And this was, of course, the impressum page. So when we go inside here, we see exactly that domain was working and it got provided. https elitebody.de/impressum. And you see we got a lot of HTML content back. And then we used again the extract HTML content element as we did it yesterday. You see, it is the same principle. And that, as you see here, delivered quite a lot of content. And the LLM extracted the correct address within that content by just looking at it. And you see the output is here, match address, Olchinger Straße 56 in Gröbenzell. So this is a German address, exactly where my friend's company is located. And then in the last step, we provided it to the Google Sheet and we stored it. And the end result, you can see here, it is the contact person, the requested addresses, and the match that we discovered. And exactly with a workflow like that, just a little bit more advanced and complicated, I solved a huge problem of my client. And already after the first run of the workflow, we discovered several companies who actually owe my client money. And the first run of the workflow already made my client a couple of €1,000. And this is the power of true AI automation with n8n. At that point, I don't want to dive deeper into the workflow, but I will provide you all these workflows and also the test data in the free resources at challenge.germanaicreator.com. You can download these workflows, you can import them, and you can run them on your own n8n account. And what I recommend you now is the following. You import these workflows, you get them running, you test them, for example, with your own company or with company owners you know, and then you go through the entire workflow step by step and you try to understand how these single elements actually work together. And whatever question question you have, let me know in the comments or reach out to me via email, and I'm happy to further explain the workflow. What we also can do, if many of you are asking for that, just let me know. I also planned to do one day of the challenge just about user questions. So if you wish to learn even more about the workflow, just let me know in the comments, and maybe we can bring it up in exactly that day that is just about the user requests. That's it for today, and in the next upcoming days of the 30-day AI Automation Pro Challenge, I will step by step give you even more insights into the daily business of offering AI automation to real companies. And of course, I will also share more real automations that I build for my clients. So stay tuned. We see us tomorrow. Cheers, Dominik.